Hi, everyone. I'm Ben Warner, a lead product marketing here at Privado AI. I'm very excited to have you here for another Privado AI webinar. I'm here with two very exciting speakers for today. We've got Stephen Robinson, former CPO at Recco USA, and we've got Aaron Weller, who's a privacy leader at HP. I'll let them do a formal introduction in a minute. Uh, just a few housekeeping things before we get started. So today we'll be discussing how to build a better privacy case for privacy, sorry, how to build a better business case for privacy, and how privacy teams can drive more influence and further their initiatives. So as we go into the conversation, please do uh, submit any questions along the way. We'll try to answer a few to keep the conversation interactive, but then we'll have some time at the end to answer any questions remaining. And yeah, as far as the webinar, we always record these webinars and we will share the recording and the deck afterwards. So please look out for that. Otherwise, I'm excited to introduce our speakers for today. So I'll let them introduce themselves, starting off with Aaron. Passing it to you.
Hey Ben, and welcome everybody. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedules to spend some time with us this morning. My name's Aaron Weller. I run a couple of teams at HP. I run a team called Privacy Innovation, which really is trying to help the business use data, personal data, in more ways safely. So lots of work around AI, privacy enhancing technologies, really getting into the business of how do we unlock the value that's in data sets in a way that's responsible and ethical. The other team that I run is privacy assurance. So really trying to help go beyond promises and determine the proof that privacy is operating as it should be.
Thank you, Aaron. Stephen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Ben. And thanks everyone for taking time for this presentation. I'm looking forward to a great discussion today. I am the former Chief Privacy Officer and Associate General Counsel for Recco USA, and I'm looking forward to sharing some of the lessons I've learned about advocating for adequate funding for privacy programs.
Awesome. Well, thank you both. So we'll get started with the presentation. So, sorry. I'll just give it up to Aaron to kind of give his perspective on where we are with privacy teams today.
Sure, thanks, Ben. Most privacy leaders are navigating some variation of what you see on the slide, the same constraints: limited budget, limited headcount, inconsistent stakeholder buy-in. But the bigger issue is it's why that happens. The root causes are usually not anything to do with privacy being unimportant. And if you go around and talk to senior stakeholders, I'm sure, Stephen, you had the same experience as me, no one is going to look you in the eye and say, privacy isn't important to us, right? It's important, but so are other things. And I think part of what we're going to talk about today is the challenge when privacy is framed as a cost center, which is largely something you do to avoid penalties. It's effectively buying insurance instead of infrastructure that makes the business run safely. If we look at it through that framing, it's easier to then have a conversation where you're more aligned with other stakeholders who aren't in compliance teams. Um, Secondly, many privacy initiatives don't mirror how the business actually operates. They feel bolted on and create friction. We all know that we get called later on in the process from time to time. Something's got to go out the door. We've already announced the release date, and now privacy is being invited to the party. That's where that real friction increases. So, one of the ways where we're thinking about how do we end up with addressing some of those root causes is to try and identify those cases where effectively your internal business customers are seeing privacy as a blocker or friction, and then working out how you can work together to go and address those root causes directly. The third piece that I would raise is that privacy work often is not expressed in terms of business outcomes: speed to market, revenue enablement, productivity, launch readiness. So when priorities become tight, privacy is often the one that loses out because you're not arguing for your case in the same way that other people within the business are. So for me, there's if you see that as being relevant to your to what you're experiencing as well, what we're going to talk about over the next few slides is really how do we get to really help expose those root causes in your organization, and then work with other stakeholders, because no person, no team, particularly in large organizations, is an island. We really need collaboration for privacy to be successful. But it starts off with a shared vision of what privacy can be and how we can drive that business enablement.
Yeah. Well, Aaron, I agree with all of that. I think it's a common experience that privacy teams are told to do more with less. And what that really means is do whatever you can with less. And the implicit assumption in that is that that's how an organization minimizes expense. And I think part of your point is that that's a risky and mistaken notion. And today's discussion is about how to change that. In every budget cycle, privacy professionals start at a disadvantage. Unlike lines of business or marketing programs, the return on investment in privacy programs is not obvious. So the pitch often comes down to a threat, exactly what you said. Either fund the privacy program or face the risk of huge fines and reputational damage when violations occur. And that risk is real, but it's not particularly new or motivating. And it doesn't apply equally to all businesses. I think particularly for B2B businesses whose primary privacy role is as a processor of customer controlled PII, that argument has relatively little appeal in the C-suite. And so too often the discussion proceeds again on this implicit assumption that underfunding privacy is how organizations minimize expense, and that's simply not the case. So I think we're ready to move on to the next slide, aren't we?
Yep, I would agree. So what Stephen's talking about is really the need to build a complete, well-rounded privacy business case, not just focused on one of these petals. So the strongest business cases treat privacy as a platform with then multiple value streams within that platform. In the model we're showing on the slide, you're building the ROI business case effectively through a number of different areas. So how do we remove uncertainty about how to use AI and personal data within AI systems so that teams can innovate with confidence and bring those innovations to market, or to help enhance internal processes as well. Compliance process efficiency. One of the things that I've really focused on with some of my work is taking that voice of the customer when it comes to really thinking about how do people experience your privacy processes. If you're asking someone to go to fill out a questionnaire, they don't understand the answers, they don't have to wait a week for somebody to help them, right? Can you imagine if you were calling up a business that you wanted to do business with, and they're like, yeah, customer service is busy right now, we'll get back to you within a week, maybe, if we have time, right? So really looking at that from that outside in perspective and saying, how do we not exacerbate being part of the problem? And having people see privacy as really being part of that compliance overhead rather than a partnership to drive the business forwards. The way that I think about this and kind of the phrase that people remember is nobody wants a privacy review process. They want a privacy approval process, right? They want to get to the approval state. So everything you do as part of your privacy review, it should be clear how that is moving towards the final approval, whether that involves risk remediation actions or it doesn't, right? So really thinking about how do you drive that efficiency into your own processes and eat your own dog food, right? Have your teams go through and submit a privacy review. Have them experience it from the outside in. I've run this exercise as well with my teams, and it's very enlightening sometimes where you're like, now I see why people complain about this. So think about doing that as well. From a data governance perspective, really understanding what you have and where it flows can unlock value in that data. It could also be clear where you have duplicate data, where you've got old data that you don't even need anymore. Because of the role that privacy plays across the organization, often you will have insights where teams may be focused on optimizing locally, but they're not thinking about the global implications of that optimization. So really, you could often provide that insight that says, hey, by the way, these guys are doing exactly the same thing that you're trying to do, but they're 3 months ahead of you. Why don't you go and talk to them and see what you can leverage, right? And that's something that comes up fairly often in my work. And the other piece is really thinking of privacy as infrastructure. So how do you reduce rework and delays across the business? Put enforcement avoidance as the baseline, but when you're looking for that reworkability, reusability, if you're doing something more than a couple of times and you have to do that manually, Think about writing an SOP, think about automation. How do you get out of that loop where you're doing a lot of low value repetitive tasks? And this is where some of these emerging AI tools can really help you. So I think when you stack these together, that investment story becomes much more durable, even when enforcement headlines may come and go and be the flavor of the month. This is kind of that solid rock that you can build and expand your program against.
So again, Aaron, I agree. There has to be more to the story than enforcement risk. So let me put the CPO's problem a different way. When a C-level executive decides to underfund the privacy program and deal with enforcement if and when it arises, that's a rational decision. Acceptance is a valid risk management tactic. Mm-hmm. And so once that decision is made, the next enforcement headline, the next horror story about who got fined what by whoever, by whatever DPA, isn't really going to move the funding discussion forward. The risk has already been acknowledged. The risk of enforcement, fines, adverse media coverage, whatever, has already been acknowledged and accepted. You need something else. And the rest of this is what else is the remainder of the content you see on the slide. And I mean to say this later, but this is what operationalizes the principles of privacy by default and by design. It's not a privacy review process. I'm not even sure it's a privacy approval process. It's more like baking privacy considerations in to all of the business processes that collectively roll up to good data governance, AI enablement, and the other approaches that help the business do business. Mm-hmm.
So I think to get to be an executive, you understand downside risk. And privacy litigation has become a real cost category. A lot of the, I would say, the professional networking that I do and the groups that I'm part of, there's a lot of talk about this uptick in privacy-related lawsuits. Part of this is due to the fact that the tools are getting better and your external facing part of your privacy program is much easier for plaintiffs' counsel to review in some detail and to be able to make claims against that. So this slide breaks out the hard costs, so settlements and legal defense. But the soft costs are often bigger in practice, right? The time taken to actually audit your systems, implement corrective measures, and things that are even softer like reputational impact, where there's still an impact there, but it's much, much harder to measure. The challenge is that even if your organization wins, it's not really a win because the cost to respond is material. It also pulls time away from higher value work. So if you're always in this reactive mode where you're having to respond to litigation, there's a lot of that, the work that's on your strategic plans that you may not get to, right? Because you only have so many hours in the day, right? I think these ranges reflect what we're seeing privacy teams observing in practice. These figures are largely based on SIPA-driven litigation patterns. It's going to vary by jurisdiction. It's going to vary by, the strength of the plaintiff's bar, the propensity for class action lawsuits, and other factors. But I think as we're looking at this, and as we said on the previous slide, right, this is kind of your baseline is you're not just trying to avoid at this point a regulator coming after you. There's also, depending on the law, that many of the laws in the US at the moment have the private right of action that allows people to individually or collectively sue organizations where they see potential privacy issues. And those firms are looking at this in a very different way from a regulator, where you can go and get the law and the regulator is going to be doing things in a certain way. Plaintiffs' counsel are going to go after novel interpretations of the law to try and see what will stick. So some of that is what privacy professionals are facing right now, and that's kind of what I'm hearing amongst my peers in other organizations.
Yeah. So I'd like to start with the last point first, which I agree with. Negligence-based causes of action are available everywhere. And the canaries in the coal mine, I think everyone's heard of the recent verdicts against social media platforms that are based on product defect litigation. The same kinds of causes of action are applicable with respect to violations of rights in personal data. that will happen, as Aaron says, wherever it happens, however it happens. Um, so going back, soft costs are real. They're difficult to quantify, but they are real. The disruption is real. I've personally been involved in a litigation that involved having a senior business line executive deposed for 2 full days over the date and time fields in a breach log. Nothing that executive was called on to do, no approvals, no questions he might have answered, nothing got done until he got out of the room full of lawyers. And again, it's not like there's a good date and time for a breach of privacy. It really doesn't matter on the merits, but those kinds of disruptions are real. I would add two other cost categories to the discussion. One is breach notification expense. So when there's a privacy breach, the breach notification expenses are serious. According to the IBM 2025 cost of a data breach report, the global average cost is $4.4 million. In the US, it's over 10. And so breach notification costs, whether litigation ever ensues or not, are serious components of the cost of privacy violations. And then there's e-discovery. E-discovery for litigation applies both to parties to the lawsuit and to non-party witnesses. A great proportion of the e-discovery cost is document review, and most of the documents reviewed are never produced. So there's a lot to be considered in terms of the rising cost of privacy violations and related litigation. Okay, ready to move on.
So I think continuing our theme, enforcement risk is really just table stakes. Although it gets your attention, it doesn't always get you investment. Because budgets in practice usually flow to things that drive savings, productivity, and growth. So the privacy story that consistently wins funding is the one that quantifies operational cost in terms of things like rework, delays, missed launches, and cross-functional churn. Those are the things that are very visible because they're impacting other folks' goals outside of the privacy function. So in other words, I would say that while risk opens the door, being able to quantify operational impact really helps to close the deal for the funding. If you're working on, hey, I can actually make your launches or I can run this program 20% faster with this much investment, that's more likely to get you additional funding than saying, we've got this new thing we've got to go and build, but really it's just a precaution against some new compliance requirement. It's really being able to tie those things together so that you're doing the sales pitch effectively with the things that will win funding, but those things are also helping to drive down kind of that enforcement risk as well, right? So you can't just do one or the other. You've really got to do both, but think about kind of what's going to get you the most impact when you have those conversations.
Right. So again, agreed. I think we made the point that enforcement is always part of the picture. I think that the other notion is there's a sort of boy who cries wolf aspect of this. This argument gets weaker over time as months and years pass with no regulatory action, and it's always other companies that are making the news. Your executives can be forgiven for inferring that your organization just isn't that big a target, and so seeking funding on the basis of avoiding enforcement risk alone is just a poor tactic.
Yeah, I would agree. So what does it look like when privacy is treated as infrastructure rather than as a cost center? So as I mentioned earlier, if privacy is only a review step at the end, or we're stepping in kind of when a project's already finalized, it's always going to feel like friction because frankly, it is. If we reframe the privacy process as being more infrastructure focused, building data visibility, repeatable processes and tooling so that teams can make better decisions earlier with fewer surprises later on in the development cycle, that's going to mean that everybody wins. A common pain point is late flagging. Privacy issues being discovered after the design is locked, vendors are selected, or code is shipped. And I'm sure a lot of you are running into these kind of situations where you may have already all of the things that you could influence to achieve better privacy outcomes, you're being told, well, those decisions have already been made and you just weren't at the table. So that's where you're not happy, and then you either end up in a situation where you escalate and try and block something from being released, which is not going to make you any friends, or you have to accept that privacy risk for some period of time until remediations can be done after the fact, which is not great either. Um, so when you shift privacy left with visibility and guardrails, what you're really doing is reducing rework and creating that predictability. And I think predictability when you are engaging with a compliance function is something that leaders will pay for. If they know that you're always going to meet an SLA to turn around things quickly, if they know when you're going to raise types of issues in the overall development or rollout cycle, those kind of things help other teams to be able to plan more effectively, rather than kind of having to effectively move some of their resources around to then address issues that you raised rather than focusing on launch. So the promise is not privacy says no less. It's privacy helps you say yes faster with more confidence. And that's one of the things that we talk about at HP is it's kind of the yes, but approach. Okay, yes, you can launch, but these things need to be addressed first, or these are the things where we need to really be aligned and focused and potentially build infrastructure that's going to enable not just this current launch, but also similar things as well. And that's some of the things we're trying to work on, particularly around AI, where, hey, we've got yet another chatbot to review. Well, why are we reviewing that in a different, starting a review again, when a lot of those controls should be within the infrastructure components where you build them, you monitor them, and then everybody else can take advantage of them when they present subsequent use cases. So that's kind of really what I mean by privacy as infrastructure. It's trying to get away from kind of what I think of, as the artisan approach to privacy, where you've got someone handcrafting a privacy review and it's slightly different every time. To the extent that you can get it more to the industrial age and have these, where it's lower risk in particular, have mass production techniques and really save those the specialist resources for the things that really are risky or they really are novel, and you need to take that time and think through, what are the implications of these new technologies. So it's effectively shifting the focus of your program to allow a lot of that lower risk stuff to be built as infrastructure, which frees up your team to then focus on what really are the things that are going to cause you the next wave of risk.
Yeah. Again, I totally agree. I think it's important to think about privacy as infrastructure as a way to operationalize the principles of privacy by design and privacy by default. Also, by treating privacy as infrastructure, you make the consideration and the resolution of privacy issues organic to the development of products and services and in other operations where personal data is involved. What this does, in addition to creating the efficiencies that Aaron has spoken about, it creates a culture of compliance and a culture of awareness of privacy. So now what you're asking the C-suite to fund is not just something that will lower enforcement risk, but something that expedites operations of the business in multiple respects.
So one of the other things I'm sure we're all dealing with AI use cases right now. It's funny for me that when I joined HP 3.5 years ago, AI was really not part of my job description or my role responsibilities, and now at least half of my time is spent on one aspect or another related to AI. Whether it's building AI capabilities that support privacy teams, or reviewing and understanding kind of what the business is doing when it comes to AI within their own organizations as well. So AI initiatives usually don't fail because of model choice. They fail because teams can't answer basic questions about the data, why they're getting it, what they're using, kind of what the real value is. And I think we've seen a real, I would call it FOMO, right? The fear of missing out when it comes to AI, that teams are really kind of trying to drive AI use cases where sometimes that's not even, it's the hammer that's looking for a nail. So for me, really thinking about from a privacy perspective, we're understanding kind of that underlying data pipeline. Where did the data come from? What rights does it have? What consents did we obtain when we gathered that data, or if we got it from a third party? What consent and constraints come with the contract that we signed with the third party around the usage of that data? Particularly recently, we've seen more restrictions on cross-border controls, whether it's things like the Department of Justice's Executive Order 14117 around sending certain types of data to countries of concern, or initiatives in other countries that are looking to, localize some of the data there. Really thinking about that underlying data infrastructure and being able to ask and answer questions that enable some of these use cases without having to do a lot of rework. You've probably seen the statistics that the vast majority of AI projects fail to achieve the value that they set out to. And that's partially because of this lack of understanding of all of the different governance layers, where you've got a little bit of AI sitting on the top of a massive piece of infrastructure. It reminds me of when I used to work at a bank, probably 20 years ago at this point, where we had an internet bank, and somewhere in the back there was a mainframe running COBOL, and there probably still is a mainframe running COBOL, that everything else is then layered on top of. AI is really, in most cases, it's layered on top of existing organizational infrastructure, and you're going to inherit all of the bad data quality that comes with kind of these complex systems. So a lot of the time, again, if we're treating privacy as infrastructure, it's we've got to spend a little bit of attention on reviewing these new AI use cases. But part of our role is really how do we get to the point where we understand how things like DSARs will work in the AI context? How do we think about leveraging some of the work we've done around records of processing, data mapping, to be able to then say, well, we can use these kinds of data for these purposes, but these ones here we need to treat in a different way. My team is working on some initiatives around how do we actually run some AI processing in a confidential compute environment so that we could effectively run the analysis and then burn down the model, rebuild it, and then start again. So we don't have this persistent risk ending up in the vector databases or some of the other pieces of the AI infrastructure. So again, thinking about how do you build those repeatable solutions that then enable AI, but you've also you're doing work to effectively pay down some of that technical debt that you will have built up over time. The risk is if you don't do it this way, all you're going to be doing is you're adding AI on top of a weak foundation, and all that's going to do is exacerbate that technical debt issue.
So I think from the CPO's perspective, the points Aaron just made map directly onto the fair information practice principles, and in particular, purpose limitation, data minimization, accuracy, and accountability, the ability to be able to reliably answer questions about what we're doing and how we're doing it. I think the organizations that will move forward most efficiently with respect to AI are those with the privacy programs that provide clear guidance for the efficient, replicable, scalable adoption and implementation of AI that Aaron is describing. These are the organizations that know what personal data they have. They know the extent of the consent or other legal basis they have for processing it. And so they don't have to make these determinations individually one-off for each new AI initiative. It's part of the infrastructure. It's part of a culture of privacy. And it's organic to the and it becomes organic to the organization.
So one of the things, and there's a couple of questions in the chat about this, is really kind of how do we work with some of these other teams to show the cross-functional impact of automating some of the compliance processes? And I think this also goes to the question around how do you ensure the privacy SOPs and policies that have been implemented are actually being enforced? And I love that kind of question because I have a team of people that do that kind of thing. So what we're really if we're coming back to kind of the purpose of the webinar, which is around funding largely, if you want the funding, we've got to be able to quantify the work. Privacy teams often carry hidden operational load across the enterprise because, as I mentioned earlier, we're kind of across all of these end-to-end data flows. We often end up being effectively the connective tissue between different parts of the organization that may not otherwise talk to each other all that much. So really understanding how much time do we spend in that coordination role And how can we go out to some of these other organizations and say, as I was saying earlier, with kind of the voice of the customer, what is it that you need from privacy and what do you feel that you're getting? So how do we help to close that gap between, your perception of what value the privacy team is offering and what we think we're actually doing to help keep the organization safe? So when we're looking at resource strain, one of the things that I've encouraged teams to do is to, if you played chess as a child or even as an adult, you'll be familiar with the concept of a chess clock, where as soon as you've finished your turn, you press the button and it starts counting the other person's time. And a lot of the time, our review process isn't set up to do this. So people are like, well, privacy is delaying the business. Well, actually, privacy turned around in 24 hours, and now you've sat on it for a week and haven't answered that question. So we're not really delaying the business, but often that visibility just isn't exposed. So it's easy to blame privacy as the scapegoat. So really thinking about where are those resource strains? How do we provide visibility and transparency into our own processes so that folks know, again, kind of that um, they understand what to expect from the processes. They get that predictability as to how long is it going to take, what kind of response time can I get? But some of that's going to require, re-engineering those processes you may already have to provide that level of transparency. Automation is powerful here because we're moving away from asking for privacy tooling to really, okay, we are going to speed up this intake. We are going to speed up this, the time to get the reviews completed. And that's going to have a direct impact on your teams, right? We're going to do things like eliminate duplicate questions between privacy, security, employment law, other teams. And that's going to result in a direct saving in how much time it takes people to prepare to go through these kind of reviews. So really thinking about what that drag on the business looks like. Don't assume you know. Go and ask folks what really causes them pain. And I think this is one of the things if if you've got a building that network across the organization where you're really checking in as if these folks were customers, because really they are your customers, and having that discussion as to how do we actually partner with you, and particularly with things like software development teams, what is the best way that we can work with you to get this to meet our goals, to meet your goals? I've often talked about privacy issues in code as being a kind of quality issue, right? No developer wants to release bad quality code, but we need to think about this as just another type of non-functional requirement rather than some special thing that only a few people can understand. Let's present it in a way that the developers can understand, and they understand before they get to finding the problem, or we're able to very quickly tell them, okay, how do we get to done? How do we get this to fixed? One of the other thing is really kind of practical measurements. People are very, very good at measuring activity. Hey, I did 5 privacy reviews this month. I did 500 privacy reviews. Executives don't really care. And that's a hard thing for a lot of folks as you kind of rise up through management ranks to realize is a lot of that activity doesn't really matter unless it's directly contributing to a meaningful outcome. So I would ask the question, not so much how many privacy reviews did you do, but how much did we end up, meeting our SLA? How much did we end up delaying a release because of a late privacy review? Those are the kinds of things where you can directly ease some of this pain on other teams. And it makes you feel more like a partner than like somebody who's coming in with a clipboard and just reviewing other people's processes. So I think that's really kind of the cross-functional piece for me is largely relationship building. And the last thing that I'll say on this topic is remember that the word relationship is a verb. It's a doing word. I don't have a relationship with Stephen if I talk to him once a year when budget time comes around, right? That's not a relationship. You need to be having those conversations all the way through so that when it does come to budgeting or prioritizing, you've already got that relationship. You can get a meeting and say, hey, this is the work we've worked on together this year. How do we continue that into the next budget cycle?
Well, so I agree. I agree with all of that, and I think this is harder to start. But once started, there's a sort of a flywheel effect. Once you've worked early on in the development of a product and service, and the people on that team see the impact that you can have in through privacy by design and privacy by default, avoiding compliance issues that might arise. And so the product and service does proceed on time and it is scalable across markets. They do start to talk to each other. And then for part of the question about how do you get people to change their minds is we're achieving these efficiencies on some teams. And if you aren't interested in participating in it, you won't have those efficiencies. That's not my problem to explain as the CPO. I'm not making you late. This is not a privacy related delay. This is, I've asked the questions, I've raised the issues. We have ways of working around them. We can resolve these issues if we talk about them. If you don't want to talk about them, you won't have those efficiencies. And that's your explanation to make, not mine. And in that way, privacy becomes less the department of no, and less the department of wait, and more the department of how. And that's part of building a culture of compliance and a culture of embedding privacy concerns organically in the development of new products and services, including new AI-powered products and services.
Yeah, so one of the things that I would say is an easy win, but I don't want to overemphasize that. A surprising amount of the risk and cost comes from data the business doesn't need or isn't using. And I often ask people the question, what's the cheapest kind of data to protect? And the answer is it's data you never collected in the first place, or it's data that you've got rid of because you no longer need it. Right. And if any of you have worked in the e-discovery space, you'll know that the volume of data, even if there's nothing in there that's useful, it's still got to be analyzed, as part of one of those exercises. So one of the best places that privacy can really think about that is when you're looking at use cases. Do we need to collect all of this data? How much of this data do we already have in a system? To what extent can we make sure we're using authoritative data sources and not downstream systems that may not have the latest and greatest version of that data anyway? So really thinking about this as being an efficiency piece as much as it is a risk reduction piece. Particularly in the age of AI, you often hear the more data we train the LLM with, the better it is. There's some truth in that, but it's not entirely true, like a lot of things. So if you have low quality data, if you have duplicative data, you're actually going to find that the training that you're doing is not going to end up with the results that you want. So really getting, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, is if we're thinking about the data as infrastructure as well, that's being used to feed a lot of these new processes, part of what we've seen exposed with the rise of privacy rights requests is if you give people access to their data, they'll pretty quickly point out when they think that data is wrong or outdated. So it gives a little bit of a check on, is the business keeping some of these things up to date? Or do we have different addresses for error in different systems? My banks were blue in the face that they only had one address on file for me, and yet I could show them mail that they'd sent to a different address. And I'm like, you either don't know what you're doing, or there's some underlying issue with the way that your infrastructure works. So the business case write-up can be very concrete here. And this is one of the things where you may not have a proactive privacy review come to you that says, do this. And I think that's one of the pieces where, as part of your strategy, it's thinking about how do you find some time for your team to focus on these issues that are important, but not necessarily urgent, right? Data cleanliness is never going to be the number one priority until you're trying to do something and suddenly you're blocked for a reason that's dependent on a lot of that underlying data. So it comes back to, in my mind, what's the value of the data? What's it being used for? And you may even find that you've got a lot of data that you can say, hey, our scans show this data has not even been accessed for 3 or 4 years. What's the value in still keeping it or holding on to it, right? And if the response is, well, storage is cheap these days, storage is not the main cost. It's like we were saying with hard and soft costs earlier. It's not the cost of the storage, it's the cost of protection and log analysis and all of the other things you have to do if you're holding on to this data that you don't need. So another one of these things where if your workload is driven entirely by what the business tells you to do, you may miss this piece completely. So I think it's freeing up part of your time to allow your team to really look at some of again, the ways where you're investing now to pay down that technical debt so that longer term you're going to be in a better place.
So, again, Aaron, I agree, and I want to introduce two terms that I think are helpful in this context. One is rot data, standing for redundant, obsolete, and trivial data. This is data with no current business value. I think this is part of what you're talking about, and it's not being retained for backup, legal, or compliance reasons. It's not clear to me that training AI models using rot data is a useful thing to do. And the second term is dark data, and this is data, the value of which is unknown. No one has classified it. It might be rot data and it might be business critical, but really nobody knows. I think the take-home point is that for both of these categories of data, they're not generating revenue. It costs money, not just to store them, as you say, but also to secure them, respond to DSARs concerning them, and otherwise comply with respect to them. These expenses spike sometimes very considerably if there's a breach, if there's litigation, or if there is enforcement regulation. So it's this ongoing, untracked expense of holding on to data with little to no value to the organization that can spike in foreseeable circumstances. And I wanted to talk about some studies of this and just to put them in proper context. These studies are old and the methodologies are subject to question in some respects, but they're directionally helpful. There's a Splunk State of Dark Data report dating from 2019, where more than half the respondents said that more than 50% of their data was dark data. That means they don't know what it is. And a somewhat older study, the Veritas Global Databerg report from 2016, respondents said that 33%, a third of the data they had was raw. And so this is why I think data mapping is a core function of the privacy program. This is how you identify and securely delete raw data, and it's how you figure out how best to use dark data if you're going to use it, and whether it aligns with the current direction of the business. Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to make two more quick points on this slide that you made me think of, Stephen, as you were kind of going through your remarks. One is that when I was a consultant, I wrote a policy for a Fortune 50 company, a deletion policy, and it was very simple. It was one page. It had three clauses. The first one was, do you have a legal reason to retain this data? The second one was, do you have a business reason to retain this data? And the third one was, if one and two are no, follow a cyber approved deletion destruction process. Right? If you think about, most organizations will have a data retention policy that puts the propensity towards retaining when you don't need to, which results in the rot that Stephen talked about. If instead you have a data deletion policy that says the default's deletion unless one of these two exceptions are made, you have a legal reason, you have a business reason. The challenge you're going to have is people say, well, I don't know how long I need it for as a business reason. But that's a positive, useful discussion to have, given some of the things that Stephen said around, are you going to train your AI with all of this rot? How is that good for anybody?
Yeah, and I think once the business discussion is, oh, I really need this cache of data, whatever it is, in order to do my pet project, it is a useful discussion to have, because now you can start thinking about, all right, well, how long will you need it? How long will it take this line of business to produce some return on the investment? Because there's some additional cost to maintain this data in a secure and compliant way. And there's some risk that while we have this data, it can be breached and our expenses for holding on to this data will spike. And so now I think it's useful because the business leaders who are telling you, oh, no, we have to keep this data, have to justify it. And they have to justify it in terms of dollars and cents and time. How long is it going to take to prove out? I mean, it's just one very simple example of this. I've had circumstances where marketing executives wanted to hold on to data they had from prospective customers 2, 3, 4 sales cycles after they had first collected it. Well, I want to suggest that if you have prospective customer data from 4 sales cycles ago and they haven't bought something from you, they're not actually a customer. They're not really a prospective customer. They might have been at one time, but they are no longer. What is the business justification for holding on to that now?
Mhm.
Okay, I think we're moving on.
Yeah, so let's land this with a few takeaways that you can apply immediately. Outside of the business case, as I said, right, a lot of this is around relationship building, building trust and influence that you're effectively putting in the bank that you can use when you need it. As the old saying goes, right, you don't wait to dig a well until you're thirsty. You need to make sure that you're building that trust and influence um, all of the time so that it's available when you need it. If privacy is the bottleneck, the business will route around you. I've seen this at a number of different companies that I've worked at, where if you make the compliance process too onerous, the business will find a way, right? As they say in Jurassic Park, life will find a way. So, as we said earlier, really understanding that customer viewpoint. What are the blockers? What is the uncertainty that your stakeholders are feeling? These may be hard conversations to have. There may be a lot of critical feedback that comes in your direction, but they're important conversations to have because by going and asking those questions and putting yourself in a vulnerable place, that's one of the ways that you build trust is by showing vulnerability and showing a desire to really understand what other people want and how to build that into your plan. And I think, and Stephen said this well, it's not about saying no less. It's about being able to say yes with confidence. And the confidence comes from that infrastructure piece. It's knowing that you've done a lot of the groundwork that's reusable, that even if you get to the point where you're like, I'd rather not say yes, but I feel I can because I know 80% of the risk is already covered off by the work I've previously done. And I've got a good relationship to get the rest of it quickly addressed, even if some of that does bleed just into post-production. So this is really kind of I would say, the foundation that you can then build that ROI story we talked about on. Because the last thing you want to do is go into a board meeting or another leadership meeting, and you're going to have 3 or 4 detractors in the room, right? You need to have had those conversations with everybody already so that you know that at a minimum, they're going to be silent, or even if they can back you up and say, yes, this is actually, we've seen the improvements. We need to continue to fund or extend the funding for this program to allow that to continue.
Right. So we've spoken a lot so far about building relationships with people on development teams and operational teams. I want to take a minute to talk about building influence and trust with the C-suite decision makers, the people who are going to ultimately decide whether and how fully to fund privacy programs. So, and I think the message has to be a reframing. This is not about fund the privacy program or face enormous enforcement risks. It's what kind of expense are you going to bear? Because there will be expense either way. You can either have the ongoing, unplanned, uncontrolled, and largely wasteful expense that spikes without warning from holding on to tremendous amounts of data that has little to no value to the organization, or funding a planned, predictable expense of an organized privacy program that is proportionate to the business, helps reduce operating costs, and expedite development of new products and services. Really funding a program that builds a culture of compliance and makes privacy and compliance more broadly organic to the development and operation of the business. Scott Galloway talks about preparing for negotiations in part by considering who's in the room, who's not in the room. And this is his clever phrasing for the notion that it makes sense to consider the interests of absent stakeholders in the negotiation. And so this is an opportunity for privacy professionals to be an ally to the C-suite. In the context of the privacy funding discussion, the people who aren't in the room are the people the C-suite is beholden to. This is the board of directors or the board of trustees, shareholders, other owners of the business. The C-suite's always accountable to those people, and we can be their allies by helping them tell a better story. Instead of the underfunded privacy story, which ends with increased breach notification costs, litigation expense, delays to product development and implementation. The story can be, we undertook a planned privacy program proportionate to what we were doing. It helped us decrease costs right along. And yes, when the inevitable breach occurred, we could get our hands around it faster. Remediation was cheaper. And to the extent we have exposure, it's within the limits of our insurance coverage. And I just think that's a better story to tell. And by framing it that way and helping the C-suite explain their decisions to the people they're accountable to, we do a better job. We will make a much more persuasive case for the funding of privacy programs.
So let's wrap this up. And this is our last slide before we go to Q&A. So I see a couple of Q&As, but if you have additional questions, please put them in the chat and we will address them after this slide. So 3 takeaways to reuse in your next leadership conversation. The first one, reframing privacy from cost center to business infrastructure. Privacy should be the platform that reduces friction and increases launch readiness, not that adds friction and delays things. Make innovation safer and faster, particularly AI, by reducing uncertainty about data and decisions. One of the things that my team has heard me say probably more than they want to is, I'm okay with you failing fast and learning something and trying again and experimenting and going in a different direction. We need, for innovation to work, it needs to be faster. We need to have that ability to fail in a way that we can pick ourselves up and fail safely and quickly. So it doesn't mean that we get 6 months into a development project and then we say privacy says this absolutely cannot go live, right? That's an expensive fail. So how do we get those things early? We had a use case that my team saw this morning where they were like, even the concept of this is not going to work, but we have an alternative that will. So why don't you go in this direction instead? And that means that the business could effectively fail and then succeed much faster than if we'd have caught that months later on. And then the last one is enable other teams to hit goals. This is what we were talking about on the last slide. Measure privacy success in terms of business outcomes. Fewer delays, less rework, shorter cycles, clearer accountability. And back that up with metrics. If you can tell the story with a few real metrics that show that you've been able to achieve these goals, your odds of securing investment go way up, partially because the other folks in the room are going to be like, yep, I've seen that as well. That's not just numbers on a page. I've seen that in practice. So really, the winning business case for privacy is multi-threaded. Enforcement risk has to be the baseline, right? At the end of the day, enforcement is important, but it's not enough. The durable ROI comes from enablement of AI, reducing operational drag, and shrinking that high-risk data exposure, all while building the trust so that teams involve you at the right points in the process, and that you can say yes with confidence because you've been involved in a lot of that planning from the start. So with that, Stephen, I'll ask you for any closing remarks, and then let's go to Q&A.
Sure. I just want to say that the high cost of the low value data that you're talking about is an ongoing expense. And so to the extent that the funding case is also, we can stop the waste. There's wasted money right now. And until you do the data mapping, which is a function of the privacy program, until you do that data mapping, you don't know how bad it is. I think the statistics from these studies show that there's more rot and dark data in organizations than people think there is. You will not know that answer and you will not know how much money is being wasted until you do the data mapping. So the privacy program has a number of efficiencies that among them, and the other efficiencies that Aaron has mentioned at several points through this program. And I guess the final thought is that the funding case for privacy is not separate from the privacy program. It's the privacy program's first deliverable. If you can't show the value and the return on the investment of the privacy program, really, there's just really no point. So I think you need to begin with the end in mind and think about how you're going to lay these efficiencies out, show that you will reduce the waste, and be ready to show the return on investment in the privacy program in a real dollars and cents way.
So we have a few questions that have come in, and Stephen, there's a couple that are around the idea of transition. So I love the idea of privacy as infrastructure. It's a new concept for many executives and companies. How do I get them to shift their mindset to align with what you're talking about? And a related question, do you have advice from transitioning from a long-standing data retention mindset to a data deletion one?
So let's start with the second question first, if that's okay. I think that so it's very important to me to make sure that privacy is not, as you put it, Aaron, bolted on at the end. That privacy become part of everybody's mindset in the organization. And I think that if you try to impose a data deletion mindset in a top-down way, it will fail. People have caches of data related to their operations for reasons that are individual to their roles. They think there's some data that's very important to them. They're keeping it locally in some way. And there's no way for anybody higher up on the org chart to know that. So I think some way of empowering people to come forward and incentivizing people to come forward and say, look, I know of this cache of data in this old system. To use your example, Aaron, the old mainframe that's still running COBOL. If we need it, we need it. And that's an operational and a security and a compliance issue to be dealt with. But if nobody knows the mainframe exists anymore because that was put in place by someone who's no longer with the company, only the people who have direct contact with that system will know. So I think part of transitioning to the culture is making it everybody's job and incentivizing people to come forward and say, look, I know about this cache of data. I think there are programs analogous to bug bounty programs for software development that you can use to sort of institute the hunt for the rot data and to discover dark data and put it to use where you can and get rid of it where you can't. So I think that's bottom up, not top down, in terms of changing the culture. In terms of this transition, I think that privacy professionals have to show value in the development of one product or service. Show what it's like when we're not brought in too late, when we're brought in early enough. That, again, Aaron, using an example you used on this call, a new use case comes up for review, and the way it's proposed to you will not work, but there's a ready alternative, and you can propose that. Now you're not the department of no, and you're not the department of wait, you're the department of how. And so you've just expedited that initiative by taking that approach to it, and people will talk. That's a win for your team. It's also a win for the development team. And so I would make sure that everybody knows about it. And now, why wouldn't you want that same advantage for your team? Why wouldn't you? And that's the way I think you begin the transition. Show value in one place, make sure people know about it. Don't be shy about ringing the bell when you have a win. Make sure people know you've had the win and offer the opportunity for similar wins to other teams.
Yeah, there's one more question. What are applicable methods to help speed up privacy assessments and reviews while enabling innovation more safely and faster? And I can give two examples, and then I'll turn it over to you, Stephen, and then we'll probably have to wrap. But one is that what I've said to folks is, don't ask people a question that could be answered by an artifact, a document they already have. Ask for the artifact. You're going to need that anyway as evidence, which goes to an earlier question about how do you prove this thing works. So move away from asking questions that have people copying and pasting information and ask for the artifact directly. The other piece that I've written an agent that will actually do a cursory review through privacy reviews, and it will tell me where the answers are inconsistent or that there are things that are missing or more information we need to do the review. Not a substitute for a human, but certainly something that can help speed up that initial, I've waited a week and now you're telling me I filled out the form wrong problem.
So I just want to underline one thing that you said. Whenever there's an answer that comes out of an artifact, it's just better practice to get the artifact than to ask a question that can be answered, because You don't know if the other person's reading of the artifact is accurate or complete. You don't know if it's relevant. If you have the artifact itself, now you have the thing you need to make an appropriate and accurate appraisal of whatever the issue is or isn't. The other thing that I think is helpful in is finding patterns in organizations. How is this initiative like or not like other initiatives? Is this really a unicorn for us? Is this an extension that we've of something that we've done before? Is this a marketing reframing of something that already exists? Because often what I find is that there's less substantive change and less new privacy risk and more a reframing of something that's already going on.
Mhm.
So to the extent that, I'm so I think continuity of involvement pays real dividends here because it enables privacy professionals and lawyers as well to see patterns. And once you start to see patterns, you can think about the similarities between a new initiative and an existing initiative or something that's been done before. And you can leverage the work done in prior reviews to expedite a current review.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, Aaron and Stephen. This was an amazing discussion. A lot of good thoughts and key takeaways. I want to especially thank Stephen, who came to us with this idea for the webinar today. So, yeah, I think it was a great topic. I think really important for any privacy team. So, if you have other ideas, anyone that you'd like to potentially speak about at one of our webinars, please do reach out. Otherwise, yeah, we have our next webinar in 2 weeks from tomorrow about the growing risk that's created by AI and coding agents and how privacy teams can automate privacy reviews during and after the software development process. So you can register for that at the link I'm sharing now, and there'll be an email about this as well. But other than that, thanks again for joining. We look forward to seeing you again next time.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank you.